We acknowledge and affirm that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had and still have laws and lores that predate colonialization. As a built environment and design experts, we join in their responsibility to care for country and thank our traditional owners for sharing their knowledge. I now want to turn over to Dr. Paul Lowe, the Senior Lecturer in Digital Architectural Design, who will act as moderator for the presentation and question and answer session with two very successful and significant graduates from the Melbourne School of Design. To you, Paul.
Thank you, Donald. Thanks very much for the acknowledgement of countries. I would also like to pay my respects to the tradition of the land, in the land where I'm currently, and the land of the Wurundjeri people. Pay respect to their elders, family past and present. So it's delightful and great, always great to welcome back some of our alumni to have a conversation with us. And tonight, we also we have Dani Mileo and Amrita Mahindroo. Dani and Amrita are both alumni of the Melbourne School of Design. Dani has graduated a few years ago, and Amrita is a bit longer. Both of them has successful careers outside of the MSD, and tonight we're hoping to have a great conversation with them. This evening, I'll be moderating the sessions. I will also be inviting a panel of made out of students from the Melbourne School of Design, both undergraduate and graduate students, to host the conversations after Dani and Amrita has presented their work. So I will first invite Dani to speak. Dani will have a 10 to 15 minutes presentation of her work, then followed by Amrita. After that, we will invite the panel, the students panel online to then, and they will have a few questions for Amrita and Dani. So I'm going to introduce Dani Mileo. Dani is a spatial design practitioner with formal training in both fine arts and architecture, with over 8 years of professional experience in architecture and exhibition design across Australia, Japan, and Europe. She's the design director at Tom Posma Design, based in Amsterdam, where Dani oversees the creative directions of all projects while leading the design and delivery of major exhibition architectures with a focus on museum and gallery exhibition design. She has previously held positions at OMA, Shigeru Ban's Architects, and Zaha Hadid, Nikon Sankei's joint ventures in Tokyo. So I welcome Dani.
Thanks,
Hello,
Paul.
Dani.
Hi.
When you're ready, you can share your screen.
Sure. So as Paul just mentioned, I'm Dani, and I graduated from the MSD 5 years ago with a 300-point Master of Architecture. And of course, that means I studied something other than architecture for my undergrad. And in my case, that something other was a Bachelor of Fine Art, where I majored in sculpture and spatial practice. And I did that down at the VCA, which of course is now part of the University of Melbourne. I wanted to start by showing you this image, not because it's something that I personally designed. This is obviously a gallery in Vanessa House designed by Tadao Ando, but because this is the room in which I was inspired to study architecture. I was in the second year of my fine art degree, and when I stood in front of this Bruce Nauman artwork, I was totally captivated, not just by the artwork itself, but by the space. This vast cylindrical volume that was all-consuming and yet entirely appropriate and sensitive to the art that it housed. In that moment, I knew that I wanted to create architecture that had this kind of impact, that uplifted and gave space to art. Skip forward a few years, and I'm currently design director, as Paul just mentioned, at Tom Posma Design, TPD, in Amsterdam. We're a small, internationally focused studio that specialises in art-related spaces. Art-related spaces means, of course, museums and galleries, but it also means things like art fairs. This is an image of the entrance to one of the biggest art fairs in the world that we designed, TIFAF in Maastricht. Art fairs like TIFAF in New York, or for example, Art Basel. This is their Hong Kong edition, which we also do. We also design individual exhibitor booths. So when you go to an art fair, for those who haven't been to one before, gallerists and art dealers all have their own individual sort of exhibitions going on, and we design usually between 80 and 90 of those a year across the world. And they range everything from ancient artifacts through to old masters, you know, modern and contemporary. We also design museum exhibitions like this one. These are at the National Maritime Museum here in Amsterdam. And also in galleries, for example, this exhibition, which was on at the Foundation Prada in Milan last year. We also do spaces for corporate art collections and even homes of art collectors and interiors. Literally anything in which art is at the kind of core of the project. Each design results from the starting point that the architecture should never compete with the art. It's always about giving the floor to art. I read this quote, which is from our founding director, Tom, before I actually started or applied for a job at TPD. And it really spoke to me. And I think it is also something that really embodies the ethos behind our work and what it is that we do. And it's something that I sort of wanted to emphasize today, because rather than a body of work that's recognizable for like a specific style or aesthetic, I think our work is instead characterized by an exacting attention to concept and detail that's always in relation to the artwork that we're trying to display or to represent. Now, hopefully the first few images that I've shown have given you a little bit of an impression of that. They're all quite diverse, different sort of aesthetics and stuff. My personal specialization at TPD is in museum exhibitions, which I really love working on because of their very public nature, diverse curatorial approaches, and the challenges that come from producing temporary architecture within a permanent museum environment. Today, I wanted to briefly show you the process of a relatively complex temporary exhibition that we opened last year at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, which was called Beethoven Moves. Now, December 2020 marked what would have been Beethoven's 250th birthday. Vienna, the city that Beethoven lived and died in, was to be full of celebratory events, concerts, and of course, many exhibitions. The curatorial vision for Beethoven Moves was a bit different. It was intending to create an exhibition that deepened visitors' understanding of Beethoven and his work through an associative works. Now, an associative exhibition allows visitors to make connections themselves between various artworks. So rather than creating a linear narrative, Beethoven was born, he made some music, and then he died, it instead displayed original sheet music scores alongside historical and contemporary works of art with similar or direct thematics to Beethoven's life and work. And you can see some of those artworks here. The exhibition had no didactic text, no images of Beethoven himself, and instead allowed Beethoven's presence to be felt through his written work, his music, and of course through the architecture. As exhibition designers, it was our job to create spaces with atmospheric conditions that responded to the different themes associated with Beethoven's life, while simultaneously bring together this very diverse group of artworks. The Kunsthistorisches Museum, as you can see in these images, is an incredibly ornate late Habsburg Empire construction. They have an incredible collection, over 4 million objects, and all of them date prior to the 1800, which actually makes Beethoven a kind of radical contemporary within this context. One of our key challenges was how to take visitors out of this world, the world of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and bring them into the world of Beethoven. Each gallery featured 14-metre high ceilings, which you can see quite ornate as well, incredibly loud squeaky floors, and these blue velvet couches, which flank antique humidification systems, which you can see sort of behind the couches there. These were actually retrofitted in the early 1900s, and they provided quite another challenge as they each measure about 2 metres by 2.5 metres. They're 1.2 metres high, and they cannot be blocked or removed, as shutting off just one of them impacts the relative humidity of the entire quadrant of the museum it's located in. And for anybody who knows anything about museum objects, it's super important that the humidity is maintained at a certain level so that those objects remain sort of safe. This is a floor plan of the area that we were given space to, and the 4 exhibition spaces are marked in green. The first one was, we were told, should play Beethoven sonatas very loud. The second one was to be completely silent. The third one should play his Sixth Symphony very loud. And the fourth room was to be given over to a performance piece by a contemporary German artist, Hino Segal, which should include a cappella singing. We were also not allowed to close off any of the doors between the spaces, so those portals had to remain open. You can see them marked in red, both for climate and egress reasons. But at the same time, we're expected to maintain total acoustic separation between the different spaces and those audio ideas between them. So over the course of 9 months, we went through an iterative process of design and artwork placement, engineering. We developed sound tunnels, which provided acoustic and visual separation without the need for doors, as well as becoming a kind of haptic and aesthetic signifier between each room. So on the right-hand side, you can see some of that materiality. We used acoustic foam for this. One-to-one scale mock-up and material testing, lighting design and testing, and building supervision. And the result was this: an exhibition in which the architecture not only provided a cohesive backdrop for the multitude of artworks on show, but one that also displayed the various atmospheric moods associated with the themes of Beethoven's life. This was the first room, and it related to the power of Beethoven's youth and his sonatas, completely concealing the Kunstistorisch Museum architecture behind layers of soft, white fabric. Those humidification units I mentioned earlier were integrated into plinths below the Rodin and Rebecca Hall sculptures that you see there. At the same time, we had showcases with Beethoven's original handwritten sonatas displayed below contemporary interpretations of these works by Johann de Voigt. And the sound tunnels between this space and the next acting as a sound-altering portal into the next room. The second room related to his loss of hearing and premature death and was clad in cold concrete wall panels and quite dramatically lit. The floor of Beethoven's apartment, upon which the composer died, was displayed as an empty stage-like surface, highlighting the presence of absence, whilst the museum architecture appeared above the walls, the museum walls, from the shadows. Prints by Goya, chronicling that artist's own hearing loss, he too went deaf during his life, were punctuated only by a vitrine showing Beethoven's own ear trumpet. Unlike the rooms either side of it, this space was, of course, completely silent, and thanks to the sound tunnels, this was again possible. The third room was related directly to Beethoven's humanist love of nature. We installed a mirrored floor finish, which referenced the horizon and reflected the entire gallery back onto itself. The artworks in this space celebrated both the beauty and terror of nature, and more of the museum architecture was then slowly revealed again. So those humidification units come back and you could see the ceiling, and which is also then reflected back down the bottom. The fourth room, which was almost completely free of exhibition architecture aside from an acoustic floor, revealed the museum's bare walls as the backdrop to Hino Segal's performance. Beethoven Moves was due to begin the week that the pandemic hit Europe, but after a brief delay opened in September 2020 and ran until January 2021. So it's over now, but for those of you who are actually interested, there actually exists a live tour with one of the curators, Jasper Sharp, and you can view that at beethovenmoves.at if you're interested. That's all for me for now. I hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dani. That's beautiful work, and I think it's extremely relevant given our new Bachelor of Design also include a major from performance design and graphics design students, so they'll be very interested in your work. Thank you. Dani, I'll invite you back again later after Amrita's presentations. So I'd now like to invite Amrita Mahindroo. Amrita holds a master's degree in architecture and urbanism from MIT and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Melbourne. After a number of years of collaborations with reputable firms in Australia and Europe, including Atelier Saraji, Shigeru Banks Architects in Paris, and MIT Media Lab, Amrita co-founded DROO with Michel Da Costa Goncalves. Her interest in urban architecture and cities form has been informed by her continuous research on the impact of emerging technology and microeconomics on future building typology and subsequently urban form. Amrita has lectured widely across the United States, and built work has been extensively published in international publication and recipient of several awards. So I'd like to invite Amrita. Hi, Amrita.
Hi,
Welcome.
Paul.
Hey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Please share your screen when you're ready.
Sure. Thanks. So thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be speaking with MSD's students and teaching community. It's a real pleasure to come back to where I basically began my education. Sorry, there seems to be a bit of an issue there. So yeah, sorry about the technical hiccup. I'd like to speak about our work from the vantage point of some of the broader questions we've been asking ourselves over the past decade of practice. I think these are some of the questions that my research and also our practices built work has really been exploring. Most of these questions relate through observation to questions about the economics and the politics that shape our cities and the consequences of these big sort of factors which have effectively come to define how our industries, define growth. I don't know why when I hide that keeps. So you see my screen, right? Sorry.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. So how these questions have effectively come to define what's considered growth. Our work explores growth in the consequences of this type of growth and how it's impacting our built environment, our environment full stop, the planet, and our social structures. And we're really focused on considering how we can grow in a more circular way and densify our cities with what we have, considering the cities as layers of strata or sediment that we're building upon in a constant state of flux. I think almost all of our work is in cities. Many of the programs we address are about how we live and work in these cities and how these cities are evolving in like strata. And we try to consider really carefully how much we need to add and in many cases or subtract from our built environment to meet our current and future needs. Beginning then with the Town Hall Hotel, which was one of our very first projects. We try not to think of our work as ever fully complete. This is quite an unusual way of thinking about things because I think we're trained to to synthesize a whole network of complex conditions that are out there in the world and effectively tie them together into a singular synthesized complete project. But one of the probably bigger lessons that we've learned over the last decade of practice is that you have to unlearn that thinking that you're delivering something that is not going to change over time, mostly because we work a lot in retrofit projects. We adapt buildings for new uses. We think it's the most considerate and appropriate way to continue developing our cities. And so a lot of the time we're trying to convince clients not to demolish buildings or not to take things away and to look for ways to adapt or add in a minimum amount to change these to new uses. And because of that, we really have learnt that we have to consider that our work is also going to be subject to a similar thinking, we hope, from future generations. So we're unlearning some of our habits and certainly the poorer habits of our I think our culture, which was to kind of erase and rebuild new things, and sort of it comes across broader habits of our consumption in general, which are to erase or throw away and buy new things or build new things. And a part of that is really this thinking that your work is never quite complete, that it's likely to form in the future a layer of that sediment in the city, and someone is likely to come and adapt it or add to it or subtract from it. And I think that's quite a liberating feeling to be able to finally sort of say, okay, we are a step in a much longer life of the built work that we're putting into the world. Beginning then with the Town Hall Hotel and Apartments in Bethnal Green, this was our very first project. It was formerly a city hall, and the London boroughs went through a process of effectively consolidating their administrative buildings and did not need to keep all of them. So these were sold off to private developers as a part of, in the hope that they would basically be refurbished into new programs, because the boroughs could not afford to keep or maintain these buildings, which are often of a really beautiful caliber. They're very ornate. They were administrative buildings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so they tend to have a lot of really particular beautiful features. Our role was to effectively adapt this, at the time, circa 6,500 square meter building into a hotel, apart hotel, and conference facilities, restaurants, bars, a range of other programs. It came with a number of discoveries. So as you can see in this picture here, what we thought was a complete room, once you start peeling layers away, actually turned out we discovered spaces which we didn't know existed, features that we didn't know existed, and there was quite an extensive process of uncovering the history of this building and developing it into its future programs. Also with great sensitivity, considering how much needed to be added or subtracted from it. So one of the aspects of this project we're extremely proud of is that we only demolished 9 square meters of the overall 9,000 square meters which were developed. I won't go into too much detail on the internal refurbishment, but we effectively needed to create or tie various wings of the building together, and that was through this rear and side extension, which was with a perforated skin. This referenced a Art Deco grille, which was discovered inside the building, and it was in contemporary interpretation of the language or the grammar of the motifs, which were in the original Art Deco wing of the building. It created a perforated laser skin, which was a process of unifying the interior with the kind of external a play of light that we were able to develop. So developing this language and grammar from the original and carrying it through into a new graphic motif, which would allow us to create a sensorial or kind of a corporeal experience of the light and shade within the building was really one of our ambitions. So it formed a lot of the definition of the internal spaces and unified the extension to the existing building as a contemporary statement. Moving on then to 6 Castle Lane, which is which was completed a few years ago in 2018. And in this particular case, we knew that we were not able to retain the building, the existing building, because the economic factors surrounding the project were really restricting us. However, we were within an extremely important historic context. So the city that we were part of the city that we were working within was almost entirely listed. Almost every building to the left and right of us was listed through heritage regulations. And despite that, I mean, we were effectively the building that was in question, which you can see my cursor here, was a sort of post-war school, which we tried as much as we could to absorb the volume within and try to retain it. However, when these things are not possible because of setbacks and because the developers generally want to maximize their footprint as much as possible, we did have to look for ways to come up with a more coherent solution for developing that site as a new build. So our research then went on to look at the urban context and build on a language of the urban grammar that we were looking at and working with to develop a contemporary way of interpreting this. So as you can see here, it was quite an extensive study of the bay windows within the context which effectively defined the core concepts behind the project. So we were navigating a series of urban geometries. There were mansion houses, townhouses, and a series of higher and lower, sort of denser and lower buildings of varying density, which were effectively we were having to navigate. And so as with our previous project, it wasn't like we could come up with a pure object-based solution. It wasn't, our work is entirely about building the fabric of a city. And so from that, we established a core concept which related to how do we navigate these urban geometries to create a concept which can resist the push and pull of the varying urban conditions that we're dealing with, and effectively shift away from the idea of creating an object, but really focus on the idea of creating urban fabric. So our concept, which, and planning processes are extremely complicated in most cities. You have to squeeze yourself through economic demand into the crevices of every square meter that you can find. And so often you find yourself really having to look for conceptual foundation, which is resistant to the push and pull of the various conditions, stakeholders, shareholders, right of lights, planning conditions, and the various factors. So really the idea for this bay window came from this position that the project could experience this push and pull, and it was almost defined by it. It led to a series of geometric studies on what the contemporary bay window could look like, and how to develop it, what the impact of distortion on curving glass would mean. So how, using contemporary techniques on curved glass, how that was going to impact visual distortion, but also transfer of heat across the material, how there were likely to be zones which, as you can see there in the red, that would likely to create a really strong transfer of heat out or radiate that heat out, and how we could navigate that by modifying the geometry, studies into the impact of visual distortion as well, and also how that sits within the overall urban framework. So these are a series of models for how the building actually sits within its context and relates to the existing buildings around it, and how it navigates different scales. So there were also townhouses as well as the larger volumes. We really try to work through both investigating space from, like, obviously once we've created, or once we're on the piste of a direction, a conceptual direction for the way we're dealing with the typology, we always try to study also what the impact of that space is internally and how it feels from the vantage point of a user. And this is the resulting project. So it was very much a process of navigating constraints, working within budgets. There are a series of evolutions. We wanted a single piece of glass. Of course, that was harder to achieve. So there are a series of complexities which come into play. But I think, like I said, as when I began, the core of our work is really to consider what are the bigger kind of economic questions, or the bigger political questions that are defining the industries within which we're working, and how do we innovate within that field? How do we innovate with them? How do we innovate with the politics and with the macroeconomics of how our cities are shaped, rather than evading that question or thinking that we can solve every problem? We have to really innovate within the realm of that field. So aside from the built work, we were also, this project was an exercise in research as well, because we explored very closely with Mace Construction a series, how we could transition into a more circular economy of construction. So taking what we were demolishing effectively, so a series of brick studies of materials that we were looking at, and the building itself that we were having to demolish, how we could transfer that built material or that demolished material into new materials. And so we did a series of aggregate studies of a composition of existing crushed bricks and roof tiles, and a minimum amount of cement to create aggregate panels for future use. Now, for reasons of building control restrictions, so regulatory restrictions at the scale of the building that we were working with, it was difficult in the pace at which this project was going for us to get that type of solution certified in time. So this research went on to inform some of our current projects because we've had a few more years to develop it, and it's just something that we're now working on for another project that we're going to be working with. But it did lead to a series of in-depth studies which allowed us to come up with these precast solutions of mostly recycled, or sort of coming close to 80% recycled materials. This also led to the way we considered our future projects around circular economies of construction, and really working on developing new composite materials out of recycled or crushed stone and bioresins. These tend to be really resistant to, they're non-porous materials, so they tend to be quite resistant to heat and staining and remain lightweight. So it's panelized systems which can work with the industries that we build with, which are around unitized systems, or they need sort of rain screens to be able to function or justify the projects. And really, like I said, what our focus in our built work is really to innovate within the realms, or push the construction industry and push the market-driven development industries, or the sort of real estate industries, into new places in which they consider that they can find a financial viability out of these circular systems of construction, which have a better impact on the environment, but also, you know, they can be justified and allow us to actually carry on doing the research and innovating within the industry. Paintworks used to be a former artist supply and art studios warehouse on Kingston Road in London, and the space behind it was simply an abandoned, or like a car park. So this extension, again, here we completely retained the existing building, and our proposal for the extension was entirely to work with these sort of resin compounds and these recycled materials which come out of building waste to effectively create a more affordable housing solution in the neighbourhood. So we had a much more modest budget than any of our previous projects, and we were really restricted to a lot of the you know, we were also spatially restricted with what we could do because of planning conditions and spatial conditions. So our focus was really on making sure that we were getting the best that we could produce, or every millimetre, or squeezing every inch of architecture out of the more moderate or more modest budgets that we were working with. And so our focus shifted to light and amenity, again, working with the windows, ensuring that everybody has access to multiple orientations, views across the city, great light, amenity, ensuring that the common spaces are as much considered in terms of their amenity, and the little sort of shared space that the building could provide has really strong volumes. And looking at a system of fenestration which is easily adaptable to the condition, but also creates a sense of this canvas looking out into the city, and frames the views out and into the building. So I think this sort of leads me to talk about our current work with the city of Deauville in France, where the Deauville is made up of much more a completely different type of architecture, which has a number of idiosyncrasies, sort of these turrets that are popping out of the roofscape, and it's a really strong it's a really strong urban aesthetic which makes up the fabric of the city, which is both has a sense of continuity, but also has a remarkable sense of the individual within the collective, or these sort of idiosyncratic forms. And I think what we wanted to do for this particular project, which is for social housing, it's actually mixed social and for sale housing was to create a sense of that individual within a collective. Often social housing comes with a stigma, especially for, for most cities, it comes with the complexities that when you're building a building which is half social housing, half for sale housing, this public-private interface tends to be really difficult to navigate. It's very difficult for developers to be able to sell the component that is for sale when people feel that there is a stigma about, living in the same building as those who are poorer or with less means. And we really wanted to find ways to navigate this and really give a sense of ownership and a sense of value to the entire building and a sense of the individual within the collective, so that the stigma around social housing can really be diffused. Because I think that it's aside from the deep inequalities and the unfortunate sort of reality, often when we design equality as a concept, we tend to try to unify it or create a sense of homogeneity, so everybody gets the same size window, the same looking balcony, and there is a sort of aesthetic uniformity to it, which I don't think is necessarily, it doesn't necessarily help. It can often lead to a sense of isolation or alienation within that. So there's no sense of unique identity. And given the context that we were working with, our focus was really on how to create a sense of individuality within that. So we really worked with this idea of quite a playful idea around the treehouse. So how do you create that sense of my territory or my individual home within a larger collective housing project? And we focused on both the sort of idiosyncratic forms of the city of Deauville, but also creating these tree houses as a sense of individual ownership could come through that process. So in Rue de Stade, we were working with a series, so we had for sale housing to the front of the building, which was partially social and partially for sale, and then individual townhouses to the rear, which were entirely social housing. It was also a process of navigating the site and looking at ways into how to introduce play and communal areas which could be shared, and also having a sense of value to each of these individual spaces. We worked the building was developed entirely out of CLT construction, and because of its marine environment, we worked with the charring methods of Accoya and then liming them to achieve a lighter colouring to develop the aesthetics of the project, and also ensuring that we're meeting the highest environmental standards in the development. So a language sort of evolved as the building was a series of varied typologies. There were duplex and townhouse typologies to the rear, linked via a bridge between the two parts of the buildings to reduce the number of cores that we would have and reduce the cost effectively. And then the street view, which is effectively this study on the kind of individual treehouse or the individual aspect of your home within the larger collective, and how you could navigate those bigger questions around social housing. Thank you for your time. That's all from me.
Thank you, Amrita. That's a fantastic range of projects that you have shown us, and some of them they're all very environmentally, socially, and contextually sensitive projects. So they're fantastic to see. I would like to now invite, we're not going to a Q&A sessions, but I would like to invite our student panelists to host some of the questions they have prepared for both Dani and Amrita. I would also like to remind our audience who have joined us that if you have any question for Dani and Amrita, please put your questions in the questions functions on the right-hand side, second tabs down, I believe, on your screen. And I'll moderate your questions, if it hasn't been asked already, to Dani and Amrita towards the end of the session. I'd also like to have a big shout out to our students that's joining us in our study hub in Nanjing. And hello and welcome. We hope you can join us soon next semester, face-to-face in Australia. And I would now like to invite our student panelists. So first up, we have Saran Kim. Saran Kim is a first-year Master of Architecture student. She's graduated from our Bachelor of Design, I think the first cohort that graduated. And she's also working as a sessional tutor for a number of Bachelor of Design subjects, including digital design. Our second student panelist is Sam Haywood. Sam is a second-year Bachelor of Design student majoring in architecture and landscape architecture. Sam is pursuing a postgraduate studies overseas and have a passion for craft, trades, and industry leadership. Alongside his study, he's working in practice and also served as an officer in the Australian Army. We then have Will Scobie, recently completed his final semester of the Bachelor of Design. Congratulations, Will. Majoring in architecture and specializing in design history and environmental design. He has specific interest in the social political intersection of architecture and is particularly passionate about regenerative design, housing affordability, and built environment accessibility. And last, we have Evelyn New. Evelyn is graduating for her undergraduate degree this semester as well. So congratulations, Evelyn, and preparing for studying in the Master of Architecture at the Melbourne School of Design. So look forward to see you next year again. She's also the Vice President of BIG. She didn't put it in the bio, but I put it in for her. BIG is the Big Industry Group, which is a student-led organization at the Melbourne School of Design, which actually connects students with industry. So I'm going to hand over, I think the first questions will be coming from Saran.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for introducing us. And thank you, Dani and Amrita, for inspiring presentations. My first question is to Dani. So I enjoyed your presentation, especially how you talked about this layering of narrative of the exhibition on top of the place that has rich historical context and conservation requirements. And you are also adding the temporal structures and I guess elements that create the exhibition space. And you have also talked about engineering solutions to kind of respond to different, I guess, challenges with designing an exhibition. So one thing I'm really interested in is how you kind of talked about materiality and how you kind of infuse the symbolism within it. And I think that's kind of related to how you are employing your knowledge and experience from fine arts education. So how would you see the intersection between fine arts and architecture?
That's a big question. Thanks very much. I think there's a lot of intersection actually between fine art and architecture. I'm always hesitant to say that architecture is an art because I do think that they're sort of separate disciplines. However, I don't know, when I first started the Master of Architecture program, there was a lot of overlap between, say, what we learned in sculpture and spatial practice about materiality, about how you approach materials, about how you sort of look at different architectonic ideas. So I'd say there's a lot of overlaps, indeed, on a material level, but also on a spatial level. And I think for me personally, you know, the things that I really took from that study and that I used still today is really thinking about how people experience the space on a human level. So when you study art, you're constantly thinking like, okay, how am I setting this up in the space so that people engage in it in the way that I want them to engage with it? Like, what is the view line that they see when they walk directly into the room? And when designing exhibitions, that's also super important. You know, I'm constantly looking at view lines, making sure the most important artworks are either in places that you discover them by sort of accident, or it feels like an accident, but definitely it's on purpose. So these kind of circulation routes through the spaces are also really important.
Cool. Thank you, Dani. I'm going to hand over to Will.
Thanks, Saran. I guess my question is now to Amrita, and following on in a kind of similar fashion. I mean, you speak of synthesizing these kind of complex conditions. So throughout your talk, you're talking about materiality through, I guess, circular materiality. You're talking about social housing and affordability. And so I think this idea of synthesizing all these complex conditions, given the limitations and realities of industry. And I know you've kind of gone into great detail in this in your thesis in university. So I'd love to hear, how do you actually go about, I guess, incorporating this holistic design approach, given all the limitations and or realities of real life?
I think that I think you can't, I think that we're living in a really complex time, because there's a real sense of awakening. I think we've been faced with many of the questions, the big questions that we've been asking ourselves around the hard truths about the environment, about the social inequalities, about the fragility of our democracies when we're seeing them right on the fringe of, a lot of these questions are hard truths in the world that we live in. And I think if you're constantly trying to fix, if you think that you're able to take everything that the world is made of and a lot of those hard questions and synthesize them into a solution, I think we're going to really struggle. So I think we tend to take each project and really look closely at its local context, and that context isn't just its built context. So it's not just the street that it stands on, it's not just the neighbors that we're dealing with, but we try to look at also like what is the evolution of a neighborhood in terms of its economics, where is that, what are the ambitions of the politics or the politicians behind that neighborhood, or the people that are, the visions that they have for it in a longer term. Do those visions align with our ambitions as a practice, firstly? And if they don't, which is often the case, sometimes the case, how do we gently steer them in a direction that we would like them to go in, without necessarily forcing them in a way that would result in us either not working on the project or us getting fired effectively. And I think that's really a factor, because you can't always align what you're trying to do or the bigger questions you're trying to answer or synthesize into built work on every single project. And I think you have to select which things you can address and in which ways. So we try as much as we can to consider the people that we're working with, the people that we're working for, always the people that we're working for. And that is not our client per se, but also the people who will occupy our buildings in the future. So in the same way that Dani suggested, like we take a really humanist approach to what we're doing. We know that someone's going to live there. We try to empathize with the person that's going to live there or work there. And, we try to really study and have a good idea of who those users are likely to be, because most developers and most of our work is in the private sector, apart from the social housing, which we're working on in France. But most of our clients are a step, like we are, in a longer story of these buildings. They are there to deliver a building and then move on with their lives, and someone's going to be left using them. And so we try to think a little bit further ahead, and that helps us synthesize a lot of the big questions that we're trying to sort of answer or effectively translate into our work. I hope that answers it correctly.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, I think off the back end of that, Amrita, I just have a question relating to your idea that you've returned to a couple of times about architecture being more of like a chronology and a bit of a journey. And although some people come in and out of it and build or design a building and then leave, you aspire to kind of design so that it becomes a part of multiple generations. And I think that's kind of convenient for us to hear as students sitting here tonight, because obviously we might be the ones next renovating, yes, or modifying your buildings, whatever it may be. So yeah. I think my question to you would be, or personally, I'm quite big on like individual responsibility and the idea of, realizing what you can do and then working on that and really striving to become better, so that one day when you're in a position of, say, power like yourself and able to influence change, we can. So do you have any advice, along those lines to us as students here tonight? And perhaps Dani could come off the back of that as well, maybe referring a little bit to some of your experiences overseas and especially doing your thesis work. And if you have any any advice for us, maybe pursuing a further studies or pursuing unique ideas in a thesis?
I think, like, my advice from I think that you have to be really good observers. I think one of the challenges is that, with education, there's a lot for you to absorb. There's a lot to learn about how to design good buildings, and there's a lot of information that has to you need to take in a constant state of there are a lot of the industry is constantly evolving. You have to learn about how to put things together, but also you have to learn about how to really design and consider a problem and turn it on its head effectively. So, like the famous McKinsey question in the interviews when they're looking for a staff is a glass a glass, or is a glass a vessel for holding water? So, most architects are trained to think about a glass as a vessel for holding water, and the vessel doesn't, it's entirely up to you how you interpret that. Now, I think you have to be good observers, like observe the big stuff, read the newspapers, understand the news, understand the world around you in all its complexity. You can't translate every aspect of it into your work. You won't be able to. But I think getting a bigger picture is an essential part of really understanding how you might be able to fit, or not in an exclusively journalistic way, but how you might better contribute to it, or find a better way of really navigating the complexities of it as well through synthesis, because we're trained to synthesize. We're trained to kind of take lots of parameters and constraints and turn them into something whole. The reason why I talked about us being a chapter in a bigger story is because I think it comes out of respect. It comes out of respect for the sites that we intervene in, for the cities that we work within, and for the buildings that we have to adapt, or the buildings that we have to erase sometimes. And having a respect for the fact that someone was there before you is really important, because it allows you to know that someone will come after us. And it's very likely that, yourself or anybody else might come in and take apart some of what I've done in my career, or, and I think that is a perfectly appropriate reaction. Like, I think it's good to sort of know that the city is going to continue developing after us. And it's very important to be able to respect your past. And this is really a much bigger life philosophy: respect the people that came before you, the ones that designed the foundations on which we're building. And it allows you to really have a much clearer vision for the future as well, because you know that you're setting the groundwork for something unique or hopeful that comes next.
That's great. Thank you.
Like to jump in?
Yeah, sorry. Maybe off the back, I think what Amrita was saying about getting input from a lot of different places. And I would add to that and say, as a relatively recent graduate, I graduated 5 years ago. One of the things I tried to do as a student and as a sort of immediate graduate was get as much experience as possible from as many different places. So I took up opportunities to go abroad during my studies. I took internships abroad. I worked at big firms in Melbourne. I worked at small firms. And I just tried to see, like, what is the possibility for architecture within all its different sort of scales and potentials. And of course, I always had this link to art, but I worked on, for example, an Olympic stadium in Tokyo, and I worked on schools in Melbourne, and small residential and large residential. And I think it's really also about finding where it is you can contribute personally. And I think often the places you can contribute the best are the places where you really feel strongly about the sort of design that you're doing and that the work fits with you. I think there's no point pursuing a very, very large scale architecture if it doesn't sort of speak to you. Then you're actually better off maybe doing something where the scale fits more with you, something like that. So I think it's also always like a personal approach and trying things out and working out where it is you fit within the sort of wider spectrum of architectural, the architectural profession. So.
Thanks, Dani. I might just wrap up before we field any questions to the audience here today as well. So before the session started, I came into a conversation with Dani. You were talking about the fact that you've been designing spaces for art and exhibitions that you actually never got to go and see. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'm sure, Amrita, you were designing buildings for places you were isolated from during this time too. And we saw in your presentation how important context study is to your design. So my question briefly to you both is, did this experience change the way you practice? And even going forward, is there anything you'll be carrying through from this experience? Either of you can go first. Maybe Dani.
I can start. That's yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned very briefly during the start of my talk, these kind of exhibitor booths that we do, which are sort of like mini exhibitions, and design time for those is like between 30 and 40 hours. They can be longer if they're more complicated, but often they're quite quick design exercises. So in the past, we had done things where we designed a booth and maybe it popped up in New York and it was there for 2 weeks and then we never saw it. We just saw photos. But with large-scale exhibitions, we'd never, I think, previously considered not going to site, not meeting with the client, not seeing the objects beforehand. We did open an exhibition this year in Shanghai in June, where we never went to site, and it opened and it happened, and it also exists in video form online, and that's the only way we saw it. I think as a practice, that's been really eye-opening and really good. And I think the important things from that is that you have a good relationship with the builders and really good communication and really good collaborative kind of process with them. And I think sort of on a design process level, previously we were always in the office. We never really worked like on design process stuff remotely. We were often, going abroad for client meetings or on-site build supervision. And then during those times, you would just sort of check out of the design process that was happening in the office. But I think these days we're all aware that that's completely possible, and it opens up sort of, all sorts of new potentials for us now in that regard, which is good. So yeah, that's, I think, for us being the most interesting or challenging side of it, the ability or the ability to sort of open something or know the potential beyond just, having to be on site and seeing things, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amrita, was your experience similar? And did you also find that relationship with local practitioners also important?
I think that I can't say like it's a little bit different for us because our buildings tend to take years actually. So we don't really have the turnaround. I think, I know this has been a long time, but in some ways we don't have the pace or the turnaround that Dani's studio experiences, where you can design an exhibition and it comes out as quickly within a couple of months. So our experience was different from the vantage point of that we have special dispensations, so our site work continued and we were allowed to continue going on site. It was a big transition for us to move the office remotely, like Dani was saying. But because we're in 2 locations, we've in some capacity been doing this for several years. So it wasn't too traumatic, let's say. I think the real things that came out of this is because we designed so much residential work, was how hard a house works when it has to do so many things. And I think this has been a real point of discussion when you're homeschooling and live working and home gymming and home everything. It really changes your perspective a little bit on how we design in the future, about how flexible the spaces need to be and how much pressure it also puts on the reality of how small apartments are getting because of cost, affordability. Living in the cities tends to, especially cities like London or Paris, come at great expense. And so, we saw the consequences of that, not necessarily ourselves, but for a number of our team who are living in really small apartments. It was really consequential to their health. And I think we're working on a couple of projects now around the city and health and urban health, and how we really think about the spaces we build around our health. And so that's kind of fostered as a research project around that.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Dani. Unfortunately, we're running out of time as our next event, the Bake Smart Medals and Prize announcement will be starting in about 4 minutes' time. So I'd love to thank Dani and Amrita for your time this evening, and also to all our students, Saran, Evelyn, Sam, and Will. So tonight we have talk with the students, talk about the intersection of art and architecture, the complexity of practice and designing with empathy. We also look at projects with great sensitivity to histories, to context, to social and environmental design. And it was fantastic to hear the great achievement that our alumni is having an impact across the world. And I think we should have this conversation more often with students. I don't have to talk. So, any last words, Dani, Amrita, before we leave?
Thank you. Thanks for having us, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to speak with students and to touch base with the Melbourne School of Design. I think that the school's doing some really amazing work, and it's really exciting. We look forward to seeing the next generation of alumni who are going to create amazing things in the world to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Dani?
I think Amrita's pretty much said it, but yes, thank you so much. It's been really lovely to speak to you all and have such engaged students also asking questions about practice and really thinking about the future. It's really exciting, I think, to be part of this. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of the work after this as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dani. Thanks, Amrita. So yes, as Dani is alluding to, time to go to see some of the work. And I think the next event will be starting in 2 minutes with the Bake Smart Award. So see you, everybody. Thank you. Thanks.